everyone, and welcome to today's Business Builders Podcast. My name is Tom Borg, and with me I have a special guest, Mr. Ron Oltmanns. Ron is founder of Leadskill, a consultancy specializing in developing leaders and teams for business impact. Ron has more than 25 years experience in consulting and education, with much of that time spent coaching, training business people. Having worked in corporate, small business, and startups in the US and in Asia, he has a deep perspective on what makes people successful and what gets in their way. Ron was born in Venezuela, grew up in the US. He lived 5 years in Singapore and 3 years in Shanghai. He and his wife live in Houston, Texas, and they have 2 grown sons. So with that, Ron, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Tom. It's really good to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So, Ron, you've been in this business for quite a while, and you're in the business of leadership. So, makes your company different than all the other consulting companies out there that specialize in leadership?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tom. Leadership is one of those topics that a lot of people want to talk about, and it's a very popular subject. In fact, I did a search. Amazon has over 57,000 books with leadership in the title. Yeah, it's a perennial, popular subject. And I don't have enough time in my life left to read all those 57,000 books.
I don't either.
And so what I look for is, what is really the stuff, the good stuff? What is the lasting and, the lessons that we really cannot afford to ignore, that we must pay attention to? I'm thinking about Peter Drucker, the father of modern management. And he was asked early on in his career, how come he didn't write books on leadership? He wrote on management. And he said, well, the first systematic book on leadership was written over 2,000 years ago, and I haven't seen anyone improve on it.
Wow.
So he did go on to write a book called The Leader of the Future, later in his career. But the book that he was referring back to, I went and looked it up, and I was like, wow, what a coincidence. Because when I was in college, we read that book, and it was written in Greek. And that was one of the textbooks we used in my Greek class when I was learning, the classic languages. And it was by a man named Xenophon. He was a student of Socrates, and it's called the Anabasis. And there's so many paradoxes in this book because it's a book about a failure. Xenophon was, one of these brats, I would say. He was well trained, well raised, but he got exiled from Athens, the center of democracy. And he actually, for much of his life, was much more in admiration of Sparta than he was of Athens. So that's already a paradox. And he wrote as a journalist about leadership, watching generals in action. And then in the middle of the action, whenever the Greeks got routed basically and were sent packing, and they had to flee, they were in hostile territory, just like 15 years ago. I mean, the US was in Iraq and facing a really tough time. Xenophon was in exactly the same place. I mean, right there in Iraq. And they had to get back home over hostile territory. And in the midst of it, he went from being a observer to being a leader, and he had to learn his lessons in the saddle, so to speak. I mean, leading these guys back. So that book that Drucker was in so much admiration of, it's called Anabasis, the Greek word, which means to march up country. But he said a lot of leadership can be seen in military situations and in battle whenever you're up against life and death, decisions. And people are literally going to lose their life or save their life based on what you do next. So I think those sort of lessons, those classic leadership lessons, are the ones that I'm looking for. And I try to look at things through that filter and get away from the fads of the moment. So,
okay, could you give me an example where you worked with a client and used some of that approach?
Yes. Here's one of the great lessons from that very book. Cyrus was the one who got all these troops, these Greeks, to go on this mercenary expedition. And he was one of those guys who had a big opinion of himself. And the Greeks did it really well in battle, but then Cyrus got killed. And since he was the whole purpose of the expedition, it doesn't matter if you win the battle, the war was lost because
Right.
Cyrus couldn't take over from his brother that he was challenging.
Hmm.
And that lesson is really about self-awareness. It's kind of like Cyrus didn't really think about a contingency plan. Like, what if something happens to me? What's plan B? Like, how will my mission succeed even if I'm not around? And how do I take care of the people around me that I have hired at a pretty penny, to come along, and so that they have an escape route here. And so working with leaders, I ask them, we never like to look at the contingencies, but we buy insurance in the event that something happens that we don't want to happen. That's the whole purpose of insurance.
Right.
And in business, we also have to think of that, insurance. What happens if I'm not around? How will the business succeed? So we have to automatically be thinking of succession planning. How do we cultivate, our successor, the person who's going to come after us? And or what is my escape plan? If I'm an entrepreneur, how am I going to cash out? How do I make sure that my long years or my, investment is going to pay off?
Right.
If we don't do what what Covey said, begin with the end in mind. If we don't start with our goal and objective clearly in mind, we're just going to be busy, but we're probably not going to be successful.
Makes sense. Yeah. So what you're saying then is leaders need to have a plan B, to look ahead, be able to even think about succession planning. That'd be a great thing to be doing, to part of their strategy. But at the same time, be the type of leader that can lead their organization in a way that creates the security of knowing they've got a leader there, and if he were to leave, they have a team in place that would easily take over and move forward.
Well said. And, any leader has to be thinking about, do I even get to take a vacation?
Right.
And if I'm gone, can the business function without me?
Right.
For a week, for a few days. And I've known leaders, I've coached them, in fact, who literally could not take a vacation because it's like they were afraid the wheels were going to fall off on the
Yeah.
business. And I said, you don't have a business then, because it can't function without you.
That's right. So let alone even worried about a successor, if that person were to pass, just being able to take a vacation, even that's the first step. They have to be able to
Exactly.
have a plan for. Okay, sounds good. Let's take a look. I have another question here for you. So what is one overlooked factor or skill that leaders consistently seem to miss?
This is not a hard one for me because I've looked at it and I've seen it many times, but people may be surprised at my answer. The overlooked factor is self-awareness, because I have, yet to meet a leader, in my 25 plus years of experience, I've yet to meet a leader who thinks that they are below average as a leader. But Tom, you and I both know it's a statistical impossibility that we are all above average. Psychologists have studied this. They call it the better than average effect, which is, if I'm standing in front of a room of people and I say, you know what, 50% of us are below average.
Yeah.
And I say, let that soak in. Look to someone on your left and on your right. One of us is below average.
Right.
That's what statistics are. And we don't like to face that fact. We don't like to look at it. And this has been so hard for me, coming to a point of awareness. Wow, Ron, you're good at some things, but you're not good at everything. And the things that you're not good at, you need to own up. You don't have to be good at everything. In fact, you really only need to be good at one thing. And make sure you're really, really good at that. And then get other people, hire talent, get top talent if you can afford it.
Sure.
But at least get the best that your money will buy, and get other people who are good at what they do, because the secret is in team. It's not in the individual. And I think the overlooked factor of leadership is self-awareness about my own shortcomings, my weaknesses, even how I come across, so that I can get better.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Yeah, so not only are we saying that these people need to have a plan, be able to not be able to take a vacation, have leadership in place that can run the company when they're not there, they also have to have an inner awareness of their strengths and what they're not so good at, and make sure they hire the right people to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the that is a big, concern, is when we hire. I
Hmm.
think too often I've seen leaders be um, a little bit of, let's use the right word. It's afraid. They're actually afraid that they'll be upstaged,
Oh.
or
Hmm.
that they're hiring someone who's going to make them look bad, or who's going to be too, tell them off, or be too sassy, or whatever, wrong attitude. And the
Hmm.
fact is, if we hired more based on what the business needs and not what my ego needs,
Mm-hmm.
we'd be a lot better off.
Right.
Because my ego, even though, it's a big one, and I need it to be strong, the fact is my ego can take a lot, and it can
Mm-hmm.
take a lot of knocks, more than I realize. But the business is something, it's like a baby that we have to nurture, cultivate our reputation in the marketplace. We have to really be doing the best possible. The business needs a lot more attention than my
Mm-hmm.
ego.
Sure.
And if leaders get that turned around the wrong way, they will actually do things that are bad
Hmm.
for business in order to gratify their own ego.
Hmm. Yeah. Makes sense. I think I heard it once said that if you're the smartest person in the room, then maybe you don't have the right people around you.
Exactly.
You're a leader of a
Yeah.
company. Mm-hmm.
And I think about, I mean, you could come up with some of the, again, historical examples, people like Abraham Lincoln,
Mm-hmm.
a great president of the United States. He was surrounded by really talented people. In fact, a lot of them thought that he was unqualified for the job,
Mm.
and that they could do the job of president much better than him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he was the genius, just like Socrates.
Mm.
He was the genius who knew himself and said, I need talented people around me who can do their job really well, better than I could do it.
Mm-hmm.
Socrates said, the only thing that makes me so smart is that I know I'm not smart.
Hmm. Yeah.
I know myself. And I know that I'm kind of an old guy who likes to, mess around and, tell jokes. And, it's like, I know my
Hmm.
shortcomings. And that's the only thing that makes me smart. Because
Hmm.
these other pompous people and these, big ego, folks don't even realize they don't know a lot of things.
Great point. Great point. Excellent. So my next question, Ron, our last question here for today. How can leaders get better at emotional intelligence, or more specifically, at least self-awareness, which I believe is part of emotional intelligence?
Yeah. Well, self-awareness to me is the gateway. It is
Mm-hmm.
it's fundamental, foundational aspect of emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And emotional intelligence is a popular word today. A lot of people see it as a core skill that's needed, not just at work. One of the things we overlook is that emotional intelligence is also essential for, like, marketing. Do you have empathy? Can you understand, what's in the mind of your customers, your consumers? Can you persuade in a way that they find attractive? And I think
Mm-hmm.
the same thing applies to leaders. Is, can you get into the minds of people? Can you uh, be someone that they want to follow? Only if you start with self-awareness. And so your question about, what is one tool, one way that you can do that? I'd say one of the easiest and most overlooked ways is simplicity itself. It's called mindfulness, but the way that we do it, the way we practice it, is just taking a few minutes, 5 minutes if you can afford it, but only
Mm-hmm.
2 minutes if you can't. But
Mm-hmm.
it's like, just take time to be still, be quiet, and pay attention to your breathing, and notice your own tendencies. Like, some leaders get very anxious or nervous
Mm-hmm.
about what they call dead time. and overlook the fact that they spend hours of, wasted, time trying to figure out things or checking messages or, getting their fingers in all sorts of things that are not productive, that are not actually moving and driving forward the business on its fundamental, footing. We waste a lot of time. And one of the best ways to pay attention to that is how I'm talking to myself. What am I actually feeling? What is driving me right now? What is really driving me? Now, you can go to therapy, but if you don't have what I say mental health issues that therapy is essential, one of the best things you can do in place of therapy is just sitting still and practicing mindfulness. I actually wrote a book on this. It's pretty short, but you can get it on Amazon. It's called the Guide to just Mindfulness Meditation. And some people are kind of thrown off by the idea of meditation, but I really approach it from a from a secular standpoint. It has nothing to do with your religion or spirituality, or you don't even have to be spiritual, but just practicing paying attention to your breathing, just learning to tune into what am I thinking, what am I feeling, what is driving me right now in this moment.
So be able to do that, what, a couple times a day, or when you need to take a mental break, or how would you recommend you apply that idea?
Yeah, all of those are good suggestions, Tom. You can do it a couple times a day. I say anytime I become aware that I'm kind of taking a deep breath anyway, but I'm not doing it mindfully because I sigh, because I'm frustrated about something, or I we all take a deep breath at times, but to actually make that more intentional and on purpose, and then to check in with ourselves and say, wow, okay, Ron, take a minute. What's going on right now? And just be with your thoughts, be, tuned in and kind of step back. If I could take a perspective of like being 5 or 10 feet away, up in the corner of my office that I'm talking to you from right now, looking down on Ron, what would I see? That's a mental exercise you can do. That's part of mindfulness. That's one meditation trick you can do. And it's amazing. We deal with other people and we see them from the outside all day long. And we never stop to apply that to ourselves and to say, what about myself? What do I look like from the outside? What am I doing? How am I messing around, wasting time on my phone, or checking out all sorts of other things that are not germane, not critical to this moment? Those are some of the ways you can practice mindfulness. I'll tell you another thing, Tom, is I set timers on my phone because I don't trust myself to always do it. And so the timer goes off at 9 a.m. and at 12 noon and at 3 p.m., 3 times in the day. And every time that timer hits, it reminds me, oh, take a moment. Take a moment.
Take a deep
Practice
breath.
mindfulness.
Yeah, those are some great ideas. I know I've read your book, excellent book, and I have been practicing some of those concepts, and it does make a difference where you're able to just take a step back, take a deep breath or 2 or 3, and just be in that present moment and just be an observer as opposed to being a doer. So right on the mark with that type of an approach.
Yeah.
Ron, let me ask you, if people wanted to get a hold of you, what's that website? What's that phone number? And we'll put it up on the screen, but for those who are just listening, how can they get a hold of you?
Sure. My company's Leadskill. So the website is Leadskill, LEADSKILL.com. So you can contact me there. If you want to call, that'd be fine. My number's 281-746-8956. I'm in Houston. I'm in the US. So you are free to call me as well. That's the best way, I think, to be in touch. And I've written a lot of things, and I've got a YouTube channel too. So, I mean, you can find links to all those things on my website. Free resources, but I'm happy to share. You'll find some interesting things on my website.
Absolutely. This has been outstanding. Ron, I'll tell you what, we got to have you back in this program because you've got too much content there
I'd
not
be happy
to chat more, but
to.
absolutely. So for right now, what would be one bit of parting advice you would have to the leaders that are listening in or watching this podcast today?
So parting advice, self-awareness is the gateway, as I mentioned. But that doesn't mean that I want people to stop there. I don't want leaders to end there. It's not about navel gazing, it's like, okay, just look at myself. The whole purpose to me, and I hinted at this earlier, self-awareness leads us to being more aware of other people. And that awareness of others is what I call empathy. And so the one thing I didn't talk about here is like how critical listening is. We spend so much time thinking we've got to get our point across, we're broadcasting instead of listening. And I think empathy and listening is one of the most underrated skills that leaders really need to practice. And again, if you would take just a few minutes listening, really listening to people generously, and tune out all of your mind talk about what people are saying and what you think they're going to say next, you'll discover gems in the conversation.
Absolutely. Fantastic, Ron. Well done. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us here today. We look forward to having you on here next time. And in the meantime, I want to say thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and be tuned in for some future programs that'll be just as good. Thank you, Ron.
Thanks, Tom.